Good afternoon, friends. It is indeed a great pleasure to be on this platform initiated by the Glass Academy and very wonderfully curated and conducted by Ethos and SH. I've been asked to speak on the occasion of the World Day of Social Justice, which is today on the 20th of February. And I think it's a very appropriate moment to talk about public spaces and public institution on this day because um, what is all ultimately those social justice all about in the field of architecture and built environment. I have been particularly very much working over the last 25 years in the field of public spaces, primarily from the perspective of that how public spaces and institutional spaces are so critical to our existence and what kind of a role architecture plays in it. And in that sense, how do architects get involved in it? I was just trying to recollect, how this whole idea of social justice and architecture, how much have we been generally very conscious about it in our life, in our practice. And it was a pleasant surprise to me that, I actually started my career as a museum designer, which is nothing but a public place, so to say. Not typically how many architects tend to do, start with a small residence to begin with. And also, I started my career as a filmmaker, both of which were to deal with public issues. The film that I really got to make in the first one in 1992 was about how the other half of the society builds. It was a HUTCO sponsored film about how economically weaker section and lower income group people build their houses and how architects and organizations like HUTCO can helps and support them build better homes. In fact, the film was called Better Homes, Building Better Homes. And my first museum, which I'm going to talk to you about, was the one which was the residence of the late Prime Minister of this country, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, which was converted into a museum. So with this little introduction, I think I'm going to take you through to come up with some of these projects that I have done. I know that the time is pretty short and I must run. So here is to the World Day of Social Justice that we talk about public spaces and public buildings. As I said that I started my career as a museum designer and also as a filmmaker. And subsequently in my life, I also went on to engage myself a lot with architecture and community, and we created two foundations, one in India and one in abroad, which primarily deals with taking the subject of architecture and design to masses. And somewhere around the line, we are saying that the spaces, whether it is in city or not in urban environment or even in rural environment, these are all about belonging to people and how do they get involved, use it, design it, and that's the whole idea behind these two foundations. So I feel my topic is very appropriate for me to talk about. I've been pretty much, impressed with kind of spaces we see in our cities. You have the Rajpath of New Delhi, the Marine Drives, and the Maidan, which are large open public spaces, streets which act as public spaces. At the same time, you also have things like the Chandni Chowk or the narrow lanes of Dharavi or the temple streets of South India. These are all nothing but spaces of different kinds which are in public domain. Sometimes they are open spaces, sometimes they are commercial, business, activity spaces, sometimes they're just recreational spaces. And then you also see in our country, there's a huge dichotomy of kind of spaces we live in. I think this is a wonderful picture. I must mention in my presentation that some of these pictures which I'm using are sourced from the net. So I hope that whosoever is the author of these pictures, the due credits to them. And I hope since we are using it primarily for academic purpose, it's all good. So as you can see in this picture, I think there's a huge difference between the kind of spaces we are looking at. One is the upper half is trying to tell you that these are like designed spaces, whereas the lower half of the picture is very organically evolved spaces. I mean, this is another picture of the same thing, which is taken from the drone shot, where you can see the contrasting kind of an imagery of the dense populated, yet there are certain kind of an open space. Within that, you see a small courtyard. Whereas on the right side, you see a well-organized, designed courtyard spaces through concrete built form all around it. So I think these are very interesting things, and I'm sure right from childhood, all of you, when you study in schools, the kind of housing you have lived in, the colleges that you go, we all get affected by spaces, both as much the built, as much not so built. And to me, it is always a question that when we tend to design projects, I would like to believe that we don't really design the built form. Actually, what we should be designing is the combination of the built form and the open space. And to me, the open spaces, whether they are internal or external in a space building environment, actually complement the total built environment creation process. I mean, without which you can't say that my building is very beautiful if it doesn't complement the kind of open space you have been able to create around it. Sometimes the process can be very conscious that your focus could be both, that you talk about open spaces and built environment. And many such cases you will find that we tend to create kind of open spaces which are sometimes not so good and not so bad. You also have created spaces like these when we talk about open spaces like the Rajpath or the Maidan or some of the central vistas of the New Delhi. At the same time, we are also talking about creation of spaces like this, what you see on your screen, which I do not know whether they are really serving the purpose, but they are very much part of the built environment that we are creating. Sometimes we also look at it, which are the best examples of such spaces. Now, if you look at in India, this is what we generally tend to see all around us. I don't think we have yet reached a stage where we have become very conscious about quality of space that exists around us. Whereas some places abroad, you tend to see these kind of spaces where people are transforming their existing, infrastructure, which is either vehicular or something to do with train systems, the railway tracks, being converted into large public spaces which are used by people. Now, this is one example. I'm sure many of you are already aware. This is the High Line of New York. This is another very interesting project. This is the 55 pier on Manhattan, Lower Manhattan, towards the Hudson River on the west side of the island, where one of the pier is now being converted into a public park, which is a very interesting project. That how such public infrastructure is now being converted into public recreational spaces. I'm sure in India we are going to see some such initiative soon where we realize the potential of the spaces that we have and try and bring them really into the public realm. This is another example, the Clyde Lawrence Park in Dallas, where the huge highway that used to run through the city has been now converted by taking the whole traffic underground and created this huge park overground, which connects the two sides of the street. Similarly, this is another project in Boston. Again, the highway has been kind of removed and created large public gardens. So I'm sure these are the kind of things which very soon India would also need. And I would say that I got lucky sometimes. I feel that in India, the kind of projects I got to do gave me certain opportunities to talk about these issues primarily, though sometimes people tend to tell you that it is something to do with urban designers and planners, and then they give you the overall ambit of space within which you need to work. But I feel that as a conscious architect, you could also get involved in trying to think beyond just the scope of designing those four walls of your building and try to understand that where does your building actually lie? What is the context of that space that you are working on? And probably that could give you some good clues even to how to design your own building, what kind of an architecture you should be creating. So these are the kind of the images that I have shown you till now. The slides that I have shown you are the ones which are reflective of the kind of thinking I'm involved with, which are architecture, public spaces, green spaces, urban spaces, which are all integral process in the whole thing. It's not that you need to look at them in isolation. So with this, I think what we are going to do is that I'm going to talk about five of my projects, which would try and give you some glimpses of my thinking about spaces, both, and most of them would be public spaces. And I'm sure that we will be able to bring out certain issues. The first one being the Indira Gandhi Memorial Museum. This was my first project. Soon after my graduation, I had the opportunity to work on this project along with the principal architect Ramesh Ray, who is a Delhi-based architect, and Madhu Pandit and Sophie Gaur. They were the other two designers who were part of this team. Now, typically, to give you a very brief introduction, this is a Lutyens time designed bungalow where all the so-called who's who or the VIPs and the MPs and ministers of the government stay. They're all government-owned bungalows. And Mrs. Gandhi, as the Prime Minister of this country, was allotted this bungalow, and she lived here for a long time. And after she was killed, this was converted into a museum. Now, coming to think of it, if you were to look at the brief saying that you have to design a museum on an important personality of the nation, where does public and space come into picture? So we also, we were very young and we were really very inspired by Ranesh's thinking about how to deal with a museum, that too in a small bungalow. The contrasting part being that it was a museum on one of the most popular personality of our country. So how do you deal with it? That is one. And second thing is, as an architect, we also need to understand that how would you like to present a personality in a museum kind of an environment to a public which may or may not always be a very educated and enlightened one. As we all know that she was very popular all across the country, and even today busloads of tourists come from all over the country who are just probably farmers and simple peasants, and they are just been told that she is the one. Many of the senior people who are probably watching this presentation would know that Indira was also known as India is Indira and Indira is India. She had reached that level of prominence in our political life. So we had the challenge, how do you present her? Considering that there are a lot of people going to come in. A typical way of looking at museums is that particularly if you're designing one about a national hero, would be that you start with where and when that particular person was born, who were the parents and grandparents of one such person, and what that person achieved in one's life. So you display and you kind of create a walking path, and then you say, okay, people see that. But here, what we realize that if that is the case, then why would anybody not just pick up a book, read the biography, and done with it? Yes, of course, you get to see some pictures and some objects, but in terms of storytelling, there is nothing new. And also very important is that when you're dealing with a museum on such person, which is a very personal domain, but the museum is a public domain where a lot of people are going to come. So we had to think about a theme to which people get glued to. We thought about it very carefully that one, that we'll have to think about a theme which keeps the person engaged till the end of the museum visit. And second part is that what would be the format of presentation? Because most of us who were young would not be in a position to take a stand on, let's say, making a statement on that personality. Because if I were to say that she is great, there are equal number of people who would find some problems with her way of dealing with things. And if I was to say that no, she did so many things wrong, there are enough people to say that no, she also did many great things. So as a designer, how do you portray both sides of her personality? So we choose print media as a medium to tell the story of Indira Gandhi. And this is how I feel that we kind of integrated a very creative design solution to overcome the challenge of picking up a medium of expression. That instead of making a statement that she did this good and she did this bad, we are saying whatever came in the print media would be the medium through which you will put the display in the museum. And let the visitor come and see it and read it probably and decide for himself or herself whether they agree with the observation being there on the print media. Uh, as you would do normally every day in the morning by picking up the newspaper and making up your own opinion about the incident that is reported in the newspaper. That is one. And second, what we did was that we didn't start typically with, when was she born and to whom was she born. We started with her death, announcing the moment you enter, you announce her death, and then you create the whole story as a flashback, almost typical to many of the Bollywood films, where when you enter into the hall, you see the whole titles coming up, and then the whole movie is narrated through a flashback mode also, which kind of creates a interest in you. I thought that was a fairly creative way of dealing with it, and many people have told us that it has worked very well because people get curious to know that why do we start with death and how does it work. So we start with that. This museum is starting on your left. You can see that there is a picture which shows her son going around the pyre where she was cremated. And then the whole idea is that you tell the political story of this personality, that how she became such an important person in Congress and what she achieved for the nation. The display in the center shows the 4 times she became prime minister and the national emblem. And then we come and end this part of the museum with a glass cube with a sari being displayed, the one which she wore on the day of her death. Somewhere we are trying to say that this is like the interval of your museum visit, where you have seen her death due to political circumstances, go through her political journey, and witness the sari and the bag and the shoes that she was wearing on the day of her killing. And this way, you are bringing a close to one of the chapters of her life. And then she is born again as the granddaughter of Motilal Nehru and daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru. And then her personal journey starts, and then it goes on displaying her personal artifacts, her books, including the suitcase which she traveled with to Europe. And then we also show her the international section where she travels all over the world, and then conclude the exhibition with that part. So in this way, we didn't really follow a very typical route of from birth to death, but we kind of reinvented the path to create that interest. So this is one way of dealing with a very complex subject when you are designing a museum for a person, and that too in a public domain where thousands of people visit this museum. The next one, this is a very interesting project, which is in the city of Visakhapatnam on the east coast of India, where this is how the beach road looks like. Probably the only submarine which is on the beach is in this city, which is now been converted into a museum. And we were called in through a public competition to design a Sea Harrier museum, which was donated by the Indian Navy after the successful completion of the submarine museum and Tu-142 aircraft museum. And they also wanted to set up a dedicated museum for the submarine. And along with that, under the Smart City project, they wanted to set up a multi-level car parking. So basically, the brief was to set up 3 buildings on the beach road, which would serve as the Sea Harrier Museum, the Submarine Museum, and the multi-level car parking. Now, we sometimes find it a fairly simple brief to say, okay, all we need to do is design 3 buildings in the designated place that the client has identified. In this case, the client happens to be the Visakhapatnam Metropolitan Regional Development Authority. We studied the whole site. We tried to understand how this whole beach road behaves. This is the picture of the beach road. It's a very busy, crowded street, as you can see in the picture. There's a huge requirement of the parking, because of which I think under the Smart City program, the need for multi-level car parking was identified. You also have scenarios like this where people sit. There are a lot of local vendors who come in. They sell. It is for them. It is their livelihood. They survive on this economic activity. And yet there are challenges where you don't find it very convenient for some people to enjoy the whole trip because it is so crowded and it lacks some of these basic facilities. Specifically, if you have to cross the street, since it is crowded, you can see that this is what we were trying to see, that within a fraction of a second, You had to be careful enough to avoid any kind of a collision with a vehicle which is passing by. Naturally, parking was inadequate, but at the same time, what we felt was that the whole beach road is already a very popular and a very, heavily used space. And then on top of that, we are going to add few more buildings to it. So as an architect, specifically after having experienced all the kind of projects which I showed you in the earlier part of presentation, where we were trying to see that how to recreate green recreational spaces without having to build more, we thought that do we really have to build new buildings? That is one. Second, what you were also going to do is that you were also adding built mass onto an already heavily dense built environment on the beach road. So we said, can we avoid doing that? So that is what we thought, that we should first focus on how do we enlarge the green public space that we have. And some of these constraints which we were looking at is what has been listed here. And we said that to the client that can we do it this way, that we try and not to build. Sometimes I feel that if you build less, actually you can actually create more. Uh, with that concept, we said that why don't we look at parking which can go underground, which was not really thought of because people have perception that underground parkings are generally dark and dingy, and especially if it is run by government organizations, they may not be the right kind of spaces. Will they be maintained well, not well? So that was a challenge which we had to worry about. Second, how do you look at the two museums that had to come up? So we went ahead, we tried to analyze the whole site. Naturally, the whole site was sloping towards the seaside, and we realized that the level difference between the high tide level of water and our site was almost 10 meters. So, which is a very interesting thing for us to look at as a designer. Then we also studied little circulation pattern around that and see how we could mitigate. So you can see that the red arrow basically is trying to tell you that it's a heavily used beach road, and creating more facilities at the surface level could lead to certain amount of problems. This is how we analyze the existing, spaces of interest, what is happening. This is a typical example of which are the important buildings where a lot of people are visiting. And if you see on your left bottom, there is that glass building, which is an existing building which was within the site, which we were adjoining the site which we were taking out. And we said this is the area which we have identified for the whole beachfront where the museums were supposed to be setting up. Two things which we did to the client. One, we said that can we use the existing building and refurbish that to accommodate one of the museums. So that way you are avoiding building one complete new building to begin with. And second, if you can see somewhere in the middle here where the cursor is, these are the existing buildings which is housing the Tu-142 aircraft museum. We said, why don't we simply expand it a little bit as much required for the submarine museum, so that we again don't build a new building for the second museum. And third thing which we said, as I had mentioned earlier, that we wanted to take the whole parking underground, almost under the area which you are seeing as green on your screen, and by which we would be avoiding building the third building above the ground. Also, when you talk about multi-level car parking, if you have to think about on an average about 1,000 cars that needs to be accommodated, you are actually talking about 3 to 4 floors. So that was a challenge. So keeping all this in mind, we went ahead and designed the first project. Here is a conceptual view of that project where we said this beach road remains as it is, but you create this kind of a landscape plaza for public and adding two small bits of buildings as extension of the existing built environment. And this was the stage when we were talking to the client about convincing them using an existing building on the extreme left of the slide. Uh, Luckily, they agreed, but they were really worried about how do we look at the underground parking. We suggested that why don't we look at parking with courtyards at regular intervals, so that these courtyards, which are at sunken level, would provide natural light and ventilation to the basement parking, and at the same time provide opportunity for you to create more public infrastructure at that level. So that way we were able to solve the problem of natural light and ventilation and making the parking area as an active space rather than just being a parking space. Now, what I'm trying to tell you here is that sometimes you need to probably think beyond just designing of those four walls, as I had mentioned. Think about the larger issues that are associated with it and try and develop a brief of yourself, which you can try and talk to your client and convince them, saying that this serves a larger public interest rather than focusing specifically on creating two or three buildings housing particular functional requirements. I would say that we got lucky that the client agreed to implement some of the ideas. They thought that it was a fairly good idea to not to build over the ground, and then when we could convince them to use the existing building, we moved on to this proposal where we could see in the earlier one the white building on the left is that existing building which was not much in use, which we converted and restructured into a proper museum. At this stage, we were also talking to them that how do we create more and more public space for the people, because as I mentioned, that there are a lot of people who were coming specifically on weekend. It was a very crowded place. And then you were still not able to address the challenge of the traffic and the accidents and it not being a pedestrian friendly zone yet. And we then said, since we have agreed to take the parking down, can we take the beach road underground? And that was something which was, people had not thought, and we had tough time convincing the government. And we could finally succeed. And what we did was that we took the beach road to an extent of 1 kilometer underground, taking advantage of the fact that we had a level difference of 10 meters available to us. So right now, the beach road is almost about 4 meters above the high tide level. And whereas the buildings are at 10 meters plinth level from the high tide line. So the level difference between the plinth of the building and the road is what we wanted to take advantage. And thus by doing little bit of manipulation in terms of the levels that were available to you, converting them to your advantage and trying to create a public plaza which would be completely free of any kind of vehicular movement. I think it became a very strong point to sell to the client, saying that this is what we could create for the public, which they would enjoy. So this is a proposal which we had submitted and they agreed. And we are very happy that this is going to get implemented now. The project has already started. But as it happens in all public projects, it has to go through a public opinion. So this is where another role of us as an architect comes into picture. That is it good enough for you to have a great idea and you are able to convince that to your client. So between two of you, is that good enough to implement the project? No. When it is public space and also when it is funded by public money, people need to be taken into confidence. So we had to go through a very interesting public presentation where thousands of people came in an auditorium. We had to present and we had to listen to their observations. Sometimes they were good and sometimes they were very nasty. I mean, you had people objecting to such project. And finally, majority said that we would not like the beach road to go underground because they had certain apprehensions about water coming in, whether they will be able to maintain it well or not, whether there will be, if there is cyclone, because it is on the beach, on the sea face, the city, it is subjected to a lot of low pressure areas and it rains heavily. Would it get flooded? So I think all these concerns were very genuine when it comes to people. And also I think as architects, as planners, as project consultants, we must be really very concerned and aware of such scenario. It is the design is never in isolation. It is not within your four walls of studio. It has to be in the public domain. And if you are able to envisage all these issues and then design your project, I think you have achieved, I would say, more than half of your project's objective. At that level, architecture of the building per se is not so critical as much you are able to address these kind of issues. So very quickly, I will tell you right now, except for the underground part of the beach road, but the underground parking is happening. The beach road is not going down right now. Uh, as a public opinion, to respect the public opinion, we have agreed to do a scientific study of all the parameters that need to be considered. There'll be professors from IITs who would be involved as expert committees. They would be advising us how to look at that as a problem. And we are pretty hopeful that this solution would be approved even by the people once they are shared with all the correct data and the solutions that are in place to address all their concerns. Very quickly, this is some of the floor plans. You can see on the upper half of the project, you can see the dark gray area. That is what was the part one of our proposal with the underground car parking, which takes about 1,000 cars. And the beach road remains as it is on the surface. But to access the submarine on the other side of the street, what we are proposing is that there will be two tunnels under the beach road, which would connect you and provide you a vehicular free zone for you to access the submarine on the other side, which will ultimately be removed once the beach road goes underground, and then you get connected to the submarine from the plaza level. So this is an existing building which is being converted. So we have not kind of removed any structural element. We are simply keeping them all it is. We are removing the skin of the facade that exists right now and restructure it to look like this in order to match with. And also here, coming to the architecture and the space around, we have made sure that the museum buildings are not just a building that you walk in and walk out and just finish with your idea of seeing a museum. The whole idea is to create space around it as a very interactive zone where people would generally hang around at least for 3 to 4 hours. So the quality of space really needs to be addressed. And this is where we feel that the space around that will add value to even to the architecture of the museum building that you are creating. This is what the museum is going to look from inside, which is again a public building. The whole idea was that even though you are inside a museum, you will always remain connected to what is happening outside through the large glass facade, which will be overlooking the beach road. This is the whole plaza that gets created once the beach road goes underground, and which is completely pedestrian friendly. This is the submarine museum proposal. So in this image, you can see the right side of the building is what is already existing. We are simply adding a little volume onto the left of that, thus avoiding creating a new building on the beach. And of course, that beach also has a monument to India's victory in 1971 over Pakistan. So as part of our extended scope of work, we have, since it is now a completely pedestrian friendly zone, we have decided to redesign the whole landscape of that area. So this is a view again from the plaza, which you are able to see. And as we were mentioning that during our study, we found that there are a lot of economic activity and that happens along the street by the poor people. So we thought of providing facilities to them in a very designated manner, including signages, which could be used by government and other organizations to promote various activities. Those platforms that are, you can see, are the vendor platforms. I think briefly, I would like to sum it up with saying it that this is a project which could have been just 3 buildings, but we took this opportunity to convert it into a major public infrastructure project and thus creating an interesting public space. The museum building work has already started, and we are all looking forward to probably creation of this public plaza very soon. And if this happens, this would be the first of its kind in India where you are able to divert a public infrastructure like a public road, give priority to people and their spaces and take the vehicular traffic away from them, and that's create a public space. Now, coming quickly to a couple of other public projects which we have done, master plans for the universities. This is a large public university we have done in Hyderabad. This is already built. So this is how it looks. Again, here the focus was that how do you integrate in your design the open space and the built environment together to create interesting public built form. Another very interesting thing is when you talk about public buildings and institutional buildings, it is also very important to remember that you need to create a certain kind of an imagery which stays back once you are out of that space. I would say, certain amount of monumentality has to come into that, and we attempted in this particular project to achieve that with some very interesting spaces, because this is a university space for the young people. So you need to create spaces which would be of very interactive in nature, gives a lot of flexibility and choices for students to go around and use these spaces. So this is an engineering college university, which is located in Hyderabad. As you can see that the kind of spaces we have created, they're used in many different ways. And also the kind of imagery which we try to achieve here is seen in these pictures. The third very interesting project, again, it's on the east coast, same city as in Visakhapatnam, on a hilltop, which is something like this, which the master plan was done by us. And there was an old banyan tree and there was an old dilapidated structure when we were called in to design a public plaza there. The whole idea was that since a lot of people were coming onto this hilltop, which overlooks the sea, and it has now become a very popular destination, we needed to provide basically food courts. That was the brief of the project. And also a place of exhibition. Typically, the way people look at it is that you could have an handicrafts mela or something once in 2 months or 3 months. So that was the brief given to us. And what we said that why don't we look at what exists there already? Since it was a hilltop, there were a lot of stones that were available. And also the banyan tree, which was, I think, here, became our center point. And the dilapidated structure was recreated like a traditional Andhra house of that region, which could accommodate the art gallery and the exhibition space. So here again, the attempt was not to add too much of built mass into a public area, but whatever with minimal approach, you could create an interesting space for people to hang around and use. I think this was that attempt which we did about 15 years ago. So here you can see that we had the contours of the site were kind of mitigated with small retaining walls, which were about 1.5 meters to 2 meter height, and you created these walkways and green areas where people could hang around. The steps became interactive zones where people started sitting and using it. They would bring out their plate from the cafeteria next door, sit on these walls and things, and use this space in a very interesting manner. So I think this was another very interesting example, in our opinion, where we were able to use two elements as anchors, the banyan tree and the old dilapidated house, as the anchor of the project, and created this little public space, which has now become very popular with people. So this is again few images of that. Now we come to another very interesting project, which is our latest commission, which is the Natural History Park and Museum, again in the same city of Visakhapatnam. Here again, the brief was very simple, that we had to create a museum of natural history. But then this is the master plan which you see, which we are able to share with you right now, which is about 100 acres of land. But before I go and explain you the project here, again, as an architect, probably when the client approached, they had thought that we would design buildings for them as per their technical requirement. But then we argued that why don't we look at the whole thing as an integrated manner and bring the landscape architect onto the board even at the stage of designing these buildings. So that was number one. And second, that I personally was very much inspired by the Eden project in UK, which I had visited. And I already knew about a little bit about it. This is the sketch by the architect of Eden project. So we said that why don't we look at creating something of this order in India. That meant, again, many rounds of discussion with your client to tell them that this project is not just about buildings, but about creating open space, and that too in a very specific manner, because here you're talking about natural history, you're talking about plants, you're talking about rocks, you're talking about certain kind of an imagery which would tell you about times of prehistoric days. So obviously this project is not just about buildings, and we had to be very conscious about it. So we started working with them, and I would again say that we were pretty lucky that the client allowed us to experiment with this kind of spaces. So we ended up suggesting similar looking structures where you would integrate the overall master plan, and the building itself will become landmarks for people to go around. So even if you are driving past the buildings, we are hoping that this would become iconic structures where people will start looking at them as interactive place for knowledge, space for recreation. And it is not just about school students and college students being taken, you know, on an excursion, but it also becomes a place for family to come and spend the whole day, and in the process learn a lot about natural history of our planet. So this again some of the imageries that I'm showing you here, where these kind of biosphere domes probably would be the first time that in India we are going to be building. This project again is now started, it's in the implementation stage, and we have started building the first building, not the domes yet, but very soon these projects will be built. Now, interestingly here, this is the type of space which very rarely you get to design. So you have to understand what does it mean to design a biosphere, what kind of a spaces you will have to conceive, which in my opinion is quite different from designing spaces inside a building. So here, obviously, a lot of scientists who had worked in this kind of field were my collaborators in understanding. So when you are creating spaces, suddenly they would say, no, but here is what we need, a 30 feet high rock that would come, and we will create that. It needs to have certain kind of a flora and fauna. So probably this kind of a space may not work. And finally, you have to increase either the height of the space or the dome. At the same time, how do you make them feel that it is being created as a natural environment, not an artificial one? And that is how we came to this conclusion that probably we need to look at architecture not just as a building, but also as part of designing an outdoor space with using an element which would give them the sense of enclosure, but not necessarily a heavy one. And we recommended this glass dome, and for which, as I said, inspiration was the Eden project. So this is the kind of spaces which were designed. This is again a 5-year project which we have taken upon ourselves, and I'm sure this will also be an interesting project for which we are looking forward to. So with this, I think I have shared some of these projects which we are designing now, and some of them which have already been implemented. So I'm looking forward to some questions. I hope that I have been able to throw some light on how to look at public buildings and public spaces, and how simple brief can be turned around to serve a larger cause of public good. Thank you.